In this video, I'm going to talk about newspapers. How often do you read newspapers? How often do I read newspapers? Well, that depends on what you mean by newspapers. If you mean a newspaper which is made out of paper and is tangible, then hardly ever. However, if you mean online newspapers, then I tend to read them numerous times a day. I find real newspapers are out of date by the time you buy them. Therefore I ceased buying them several years ago. As in previous videos, I talked about fillers. You need filler phrases to give yourself thinking time. Here is another example of one. Asking yourself the question, which is probably something that you already do in your own language. So, the question, how often do you read newspapers? How often do I read newspapers? And it gives yourself some valuable thinking time before you start your answer. Another filler word is well. And native English speakers use this all the time because it gives you a bit more thinking time. Well. That depends. Subject-verb agreement is important if you want to get a high grade in IELTS. So remember to use the S whenever you have that or it. Is made out of. You must use a range of vocabulary in IELTS speaking, and so you need to be able to use passives. Here is a good example of the passive. If you do not know how to use passives, then I strongly recommend that you study grammar before doing this test. Tangible. This means it's a real thing. You can touch it, you can pick it up. Hardly ever. This means not very often at all. Remember that the IELTS examiner is listening for discourse markers for your cohesion grade. Discourse markers give your answer organisation. So we've got a however, a therefore. Tend to. This is a very useful verb and it comes from the same word family as to have a tendency to do. And we use it to talk about things that you do often. And it's easy to use because it's just tend to plus the infinitive. I tend to get up at 7 o'clock. I tend to have lunch at 7:15. IELTS examiners are listening for your use of referencing. This is a very basic example of referencing, and it's the ability to use pronouns correctly. Here, the them, and this them here, is referring back to newspapers. Numerous. This sounds more complex than saying many. Out of date means it's old, it's no longer irrelevant. This is quite a formal word, but I'm using it here to impress the IELTS examiner. Ceased, meaning stopped. And when we use it with a verb, it must be the ing form of the verb. I ceased buying. And several means a few. Which is more important where you live, local or national newspapers? Now, that's an interesting question that I haven't really given much thought to before, because I haven't purchased one for many years. But if I had to say, then it would be local newspapers. The local newspapers are generally published once a week and are filled with local news, which, unlike national news, doesn't date as quickly. Here's another example of a filler phrase, giving yourself some time to think. Now, that's an interesting question that I haven't really given much thought to before. Instead of using bought, we can say. Here's the second conditional. Using this in your IELTS speaking will impress the IELTS examiner and show that you have a good grammatical range. Are generally published. This is the passive. You need to be using the passive to impress the examiner. Are filled. Another example of the passive. Unlike means different from. And to date means to become out of date. Are newspapers important in your country? As I'm not an avid newspaper reader, it's hard to say, but I guess they're not as important as they used to be in the past. Because we have 24-hour rolling news, it is possible to access the news online or on 24-hour news programmes any time, day or night. Therefore, they are certainly not as crucial as they used to be. In the olden days, when we didn't used to have the internet, then you would see people on public transport reading newspapers. However, in contemporary society, we are all glued to our phones and electronic gadgets. This means a person who reads newspapers a lot, and you can use the word avid with other words such as an avid book reader. It's hard to say. This is another filler phrase when you cannot give an answer straight away, and it gives you some extra thinking time. I guess, instead of using I think, you can say I guess. 24-hour rolling news is news that's been updated all the time. To access, to look at. Discourse markers being used again to link your answer and add to your cohesion and coherence grade. Therefore and however. Crucial. I've talked about this in previous videos, how it's important to have lots of different words to say important. Crucial means important. Used to plus infinitive is a good verb to include, again to show your range of grammar. In the olden days, in the past. And we didn't used to have. When we use used to in the past tense, there's no D on the end of the verb, although it sounds like there is when we say it. But if you're going to use this in IELTS writing, remember that this does not have a D. In contemporary society, nowadays, glued to. This means you're unable to stop watching something. Electronic gadgets, this is a very useful word for both writing and speaking, meaning any small electrical thing is a gadget, a device. Do you think newspapers will be more or less important in the future? I reckon that because newspapers have been in decline over the course of the last decade, then this trend is likely to continue. I imagine the day will come when newspapers are obsolete and the only place to see them is in museums. They'll be a relic of a past life, and future generations will never know what it feels like to get print all over your hands. Another verb that you could use instead of saying I think, it is quite informal, but would impress the IELTS examiner in IELTS speaking. To be in decline means to be decreasing. Over the course of, meaning over the period of. A trend is a pattern, and is likely to, will probably. I imagine is another way of saying I think. The day will come, this means the day will arrive. Obsolete, they no longer exist. A relic, a thing from the past. Future generations, a good way to talk about people in the future and useful for IELTS writing too. Print. This is the ink that you get on your hands when you're reading the newspaper. Make sure that you complete the vocabulary quiz following this video to ensure that you can remember some of the vocabulary that is useful from this lesson. Thanks for watching.